here we are again. This recurring sort of ebb and flow of coming in the hall and going out. This is from The Onion. Saying he was trying not to think about how awful the next few days would be, Master Ayahuasca shaman Piero Salazar expressed his sense of dread Tuesday as he confirmed his week would once again be spent guiding American tech CEOs to spiritual oneness. I'm not sure I can take another one of them telling me how some guy named Ryan or Spencer from their Zog Sports League turned them on to this whole ayahuasca thing. I know it's my job to guide them, but after meeting these guys, the last thing I want to do is witness the visions they have deep in their souls, he said. Even when I do manage to help one of them overcome a long-held fear, it's always something like anxiety over a patent lawsuit. They all leave even more convinced than ever that their true purpose in life is to invent some new kind of crowdfunding app or teleconferencing software. At least you can't argue with the money, he said. These people will pay almost anything to escape from themselves for a little while. So, young 32-year-old tech billionaire is immune from a certain amount of suffering and also believing that happiness is in somewhere out there kind of thing. So you may have wished that we were giving you a hallucinogenic tea at certain times today. But you would have had to pay more for that, I think. I mean, the crazy thing is that retreats are designed in a certain way that you can't get away from yourself. And when teachers used to say that, I would say, like, well, myself is actually not in the retreat. Myself is out of here. Like, here I'm in the retreat. This is not myself. This is just the way that I am right here, and I'm bored or whatever, filled with lust or whatever things are going on because of the retreat. That was my mind at the time. Not really like taking responsibility inward quite enough. And of course it's true that environments affect us and different things affect us, but the general idea here in a certain way is to make it as boring as possible. So Chogyam Trungpa said this, people see Zen environments as being so aesthetically beautiful, with the nothing much, the bare walls and the black cushions all in perfect rows. And he says, no, everything is stripped away so that what you're left with is your own mind. Otherwise, it would just be more entertainment. So this talk is a little bit about the mind and a little bit about compassion. And that what we're doing here is active. It's a form of compassionate action. So to say, we come on retreat looking for a break from busyness or to find purpose or something, and instead we see restlessness, sadness, horrible remorse, boredom and depression and malaise at times. The same thing in a way with our larger outer life as we set out to look for, is that the pursuit of happiness, and instead it's the trash and taxes and things that have to be done that are fairly mundane and not exactly what our mind may have been looking for, or things that are worse than mundane, real pain and loss and things that don't work out, and there's almost no way of saying that, even making lemonade out of it. What about that? And Pat was speaking last night about that there is suffering in every life. If we look around the room and just open our hearts in a certain way, we can see that everyone has our beauty, but everyone also has challenges. Like, it kind of comes with a package. It comes with being born. And sometimes there are different degrees of that in life. What is the cause of suffering? What is the cure? For ourselves, is that I read at the end of the talk the other night, like, we're young enough and we have stable enough circumstances, enough prosperity and leisure time to be able to come and train the mind like this, what we're doing. And that is sort of the healing gesture that we're making towards ourselves, even if it may feel sort of like, demanding or difficult at times. The Buddha said, I don't teach a philosophical view. Much as non-self may sound like that, but he says, I don't teach a philosophical view, I teach what to do and what not to do. Very practical, in a sense, action-oriented teaching, not exactly a religion. In the Mahayana tradition, they've boiled it down to what they call wisdom and compassion, which would just be like the insight and the heart. And they say compassion because to include the suffering of the world. The word compassion in Sanskrit and Pali is karuna. And ka, I like playing with these things. Ka is like karma, which means doing. It's your doing, your action. Ru is meant to be the sound of weeping, like woo, 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 woo. So karuna is doing something about all the weeping. And the word for ka or kur is also the same as creative. So it's taking a creative and appropriate response to the trouble of our life and of our heart. So having grounded in the body, body sensations, and that is partly to sidestep the habitual way that our mind just keeps constructing our experience, and to, sort of starve the mental system a little bit of attentional energy so that we can take a different position. Like, it's almost, you'd say, what's called a paradoxical move. Like, you say you're going to pay attention to your breath so that you can see that you get distracted. And by calling it a distraction, we're not really understanding in a certain way what we learn from. It's almost like you get to bracket these thoughts and say, like, I am thinking about this. This is a thought. This is what the experience of thinking is. And by taking a different perspective, we're like a little bit out of the mysterious entrancement or the dream state that our thoughts put us into. Where in a way we just become an automaton controlled by a whole lot of unexamined thinking and conditioning. So it's a critical part of this to see how our mind works and to see the certain ways. I mean, our mind is not completely a suffering factory, but much of the suffering we have is caused by the faulty way that our mind works. It works good enough for survival, but maybe not good enough for optimal happiness. It's the great jazz musician Herbie Hancock came to Harvard a few years ago to give a series of lectures, and he's a Buddhist, so he's very easy to listen to, but those lectures are usually pretty great. He says, you think you'll be happy when you have a beach vacation with a margarita in your hand. That's not happiness. It's not what you have, it's what you can give. You can't buy compassion, which is what you can give. Perfection is a fairy tale that keeps us from being present. So back to the ayahuasca or the CEOs, like the art of the deal, the deal that we make with reality is often taking us out of being present. So the experiencer of all of our experiences, the mind, let's say that's what's going on here, is that everything inside and outside of us is falling upon this capacity that we have to be conscious of something. So where do we find suffering in our mind and in our heart? Where do we find happiness? In the same place. How convenient, as Larry Rosenberg said. So this resilient mind is able to be both happy and to suffer. That's kind of part of a key to the mystery of our mind, that's able to be like, when we develop its spacious aspect, it can allow both happiness and difficulty and still remain open and actually somewhat unaffected. That's the non-clinging side of the mind, which is always there, but just gets obscured by the way that we cling and grasp onto things that are actually temporary and use them to define ourselves with and to beat each other with. So in some schools of practice, they say to understand the nature of the mind is enlightenment, to see how it gets stuck, but also see how it's ultimately freed. So that's kind of what we're doing here. And as we study this, seeing how the mind gets caught almost like a fish hook in your cheek by certain thoughts or images or disturbances or worries, and how then those worries pass away and at times just have no hold on us whatsoever, like to really appreciate the times like that. At one time, when I first met my husband, he has a daughter, and I was about, in my late 30s, and I'd been a meditator for a long time, and just sort of met this guy. He had a family, he had a daughter, and it was looking like it was getting more and more serious, and I also was becoming the stepmom all of a sudden, and feeling like they were like really connected to each other, and I was like this outlier sort of in the early parts of our relationship, that the daughter would like make a little fuss, and then the dad would like go to comfort her and like not talk to me for like a day or something like that, because she like needed him, and it was really hard. So I started thinking like, well, if I'm going to be in a family then and live this kind of life rather than being just a meditator, then I'm going to have to get my own baby, So I worked on that for a very long time. And one time I was talking to a friend who'd gone through the same dilemma of saying, like, I got to have a baby or else I'll never be happy and I can't be in this relationship and stuff like that. And she said she took this question to the Dalai Lama, and he looked at her and he said, do you want to have a baby every second of the day? And she said, no, not every second. And he was like, well, see, you're sort of free. Your freedom is deeper than needing a baby. And that didn't go very far with me at first. I was like, yeah, but when I want one, I really want one, and the in-between times don't mean as much as the depth of this need and stuff. Anyway, I worked on it for quite some period of time, and then I ended up choosing not to do it and saying, like, I went for 38 or 39 years without really wanting one, and in the situation I was in, I could either have one and risk being a single mother in my own house or out of it, because I wasn't sure that it was going to work with the people that I had joined as a family. Or I could continue being a quasi-meditator, like with a little bit less time to do long retreats. So that's what I've decided. And I'm pretty happy about it, actually. I don't feel like it, my life is unworthy or meaningless. But it was a big choice, for me. I didn't know how I was going to afford it either, but that's another thing. How can the human population be increasing? It's unbelievable. But what we don't realize actually is how much potential there is on the upside from a trained mind. Like, we can look around at all the violence and horror that there is in this world, and all the cruelty and the disturbance and stuff, and the fact that the climate is getting ruined because of people, really, and our inability to come together and decide that reality is true and that we should all get together and figure, let go of a few plane trips and all the cow farts and figure it out. But maybe the upside is of a trained mind is as good as the difficult mind, maybe better, but more rare because it's so hard. There's not a pill. And what we're doing here is it. And you see what it's like. It's like trying to swim across the ocean sometimes. My friend Matthew Ricard, who's been a Tibetan Buddhist monk for a long time, has gone through all those MRI tests. And he has a mind that is so unflinching that he's surpassed all gun instructors, Navy SEALs, Green Berets, and everything. He can have a gun shut off behind him and he doesn't flinch. His mind doesn't register even a bump. He just goes into the open state, hears it as a sound, and it doesn't bother him at all. And somebody who's taught on a pistol range for many years can't do that. They can be habituated to the sound, but their mind isn't really trained to look at it and deconstruct and like be there in the moment, so that then what's there in the moment is the awareness, not the reaction. So things can be as they are, and if the mind only sees them, then the reactivity gets shifted. Pat was talking last night. We call it hindrances, but it's not just in meditation that they're hindrances. Those are things that build buildings and build bombs, those hindrances. Anger, for example, and desire, restlessness. I think sloth and torpor is related to despair, that, when you don't want to do something about anything, you have no aim in your mind. You think, well, we can't really do anything about it, so we might as well just continue the way we are. My friend Joe, who's a meditator, has recently been in some real financial difficulties in his family, and he says the practice is amazing. If you can't be cheerful when things are difficult, what good is it? Good is it to meditate? So maybe we came here to be happy, and our mind would have liked to have a party or some drugs or something, and instead it's kind of like we've taken our mind partially apart and it's now lying in pieces on the floor, and we don't really know how to put it back together again. Pat and I tell you that your deepest nature is purity and kindness and compassionate responsiveness, but shining through the grease only every few minutes this, and the rest of the time it's like, who's that talking upstairs? I'm missing my stepdaughter's graduation in New York now. Like, we're actually like super good friends, and I really love her and she loves me, and I've found like the place where I became the one that she told when she got a navel ring, like a ring in her belly button, and she didn't want either one of her parents to react before she asked me. Like, she said, what do you think my dad is going to say about this? And I'm like, I love being a stepmom, like, I know this stuff, And I never have to tell her what she's doing wrong unless she's actually like attacking me in person, and that's very rare these days. But it's really true that part of the question that we have for our practice is, how do we live with the pain of ourself and the sufferings and the losses and the pain of people we love, and pains in communities and society and, the Sangha and this big world. And it can be often very, we get so kind of focused in on what's happening inside of us that sometimes we don't really see that this boredom, which may be the state that we're afraid of more than anything, or shame or something like that, actually relates to bigger things. Like, we just get in so tight with it here. But have you noticed at times when you're in something that is disagreeable, how desperate is our wish to be happier, how much we'd like to be somewhere else, or how much that inner judge and critic can come and say, like, if only I were different, if only I could feel joy right now instead of what I'm feeling. Or for those, other moments, like usually this sort of judgment and blame is something that points randomly in whatever direction it seems to be pointing. It's either my fault, or it's the food, or Pat talking too much, or one's past, or lack of concentration, or whatever that might be. My meditation is terrible. Why are these the teachers? Why don't I have like a more famous teacher? Or, their talk should be more inspiring. Or it smells funny in here, or whatever it might be. I wish I'd brought warmer clothes. I have to wear the same thing every day. Where's the dessert? Back to that one. In general, or what the dessert represents. My friend Jean Ann was on a retreat one time where she was really quite mindful, and she said she was taking a walk, and it was like 6 degrees of separation. It was 9 thoughts from listening to the beautiful song of a bird to wishing she'd been born in a different family. And her family was not great. I mean, I have to say, knowing what it was. In the New York Times in 2011, there was a TV review of Desperate Housewives, and it started off saying, we are faced with 2 possibilities: that there's no free will, which means that God actually planned for there to be a Desperate Housewives, or that there is free will, which means that it could have been a better show. So free will, like, there is this kind of limited area in which we practice this kind of frame of moment to moment that seems small, but this is one of the places where we can keep sort of moving the dial of what free will we do have, and because of neuroplasticity, because the emotional part of our brain is the most important one, and because we seem to have some kind of influence of choice over our mind state to be present. And what I think is the brilliant thing about this is that the present moment is here. It's actually what's here. And the present moment experience is actually what we have already. So it makes it kind of like, as Larry Rosenberg was saying, how convenient. And how weird that we spend a lot of our time somewhere else, or wishing for something else, or trying to displace this with something else. The Dalai Lama says happiness and unhappiness depend much more on our attitude than what happens outwardly. So if we don't know how to train our attitude, then we are much more the victim of what's happened to us outwardly, either in the past or in the present moment. So let's say bringing mindfulness is a kind of attitude, and kindness is definitely an attitude, and tolerance and forgiveness. These are all attitudes that we can take, and there's a little space where we just keep hammering that one again and again and again until it starts to become more of a habit than the other thing, and things may start to happen spontaneously in a different way from the way they would have happened before. Like, so many times people will say, like, now somebody cuts me off in traffic, and instead of saying, like, asshole, and stepping on the gas and trying to scare them that you might actually hit them with your car, you say, like, wow, maybe their mother is dying or something, or just let them go. It's a lot easier to not engage with a person like that. I don't want to endanger everybody. You don't have the same response. When I used to teach in New York, there was, we were on the 7th floor. I think I probably told you that first night about the woman who thought she had to jump out the window or stab us or something. And that same 7th floor was right over the entrance, close to the entrance to the Holland Tunnel, where people would go back to New Jersey at the end of the workday. And sometimes the traffic would get really bad, and sometimes there would be this sort of epidemic of honking. It's like the light would be red, and then it would be green, and people would get to move forward like a third of a block or something because of all the stuff, and then they'd have to stop again. And then invariably somebody 4 rows back from the red light would just honk. And it's because they couldn't contain how they felt. It's not productive. Like, they're not going to move a car. They're just making life worse for everybody because they can't tolerate their own internal discomfort. They didn't have the space to be kind or to actually see the reality that it's not going to help you letting this expression out. It's just actually making things worse. So let's say we're quite used to the happiness of our senses and the happy mind states. And I don't want to gloss over the importance of this in our life. Like, we would just fry if there was nothing that was ever a relief, if there was no beauty, if there was no love, if our ordinary life wasn't to some tolerable level. That's in the Buddhist teachings too, in the teachings of the 3 realms, where it said that the human realm has, enough happiness to keep us from going insane, and enough suffering to teach us to be enlightened. Like they say, the God realms, where everything is so pleasant that your orgasms last for 7 years. Does that sound exhausting? Or good, You also, I guess, have the nervous system that can take that. But everyone's absolutely gorgeous until they get to be a certain age, and then you start to smell, and the flowers that are permanently on your head suddenly wilt. And everyone gets, at that state, gets so freaked out that their mind just cannot take it. And all your friends shun you as a god. They're like, ooh, you smell, like, I don't love you anymore. Like, let's go with the pleasant people. So where it's pleasure too much, this is a metaphor really for the mind that's addicted to pleasure. If there's no ability to tolerate any kind of suffering, it's really quite a cruel world. Fortunately, we have a certain amount of natural compassion, and we understand that a happy life includes a certain amount of compassion for what's not perfect. That's a bit what we're training in. The Buddha also said, which is one of my favorite things, that someone who has a degree of ethics and compassion is able to enjoy sense pleasures more than someone who's like a drug dealer or a criminal or that. You might be able to see that if you're mind is calm and you have a connection with your own good heart, that the pleasures of life are actually more accessible to you, like you're more available for what's beautiful in life. Even though you know it may not last or support you, it is somewhat supportive. The Greek school, the Epicureans, who are kind of become a misnomer now as like people who are only about pleasure. It's not really true. What they said was that the simple pleasures, like accessible in daily life, like really tasting the lentils in a simple dish of lentils, that's kind of a cultivation of well-being that's not just excessive. They were actually against too much butter in their dishes and stuff like that. Here's a story. So the happiness of the senses, it comes and goes, but it has its reality, it has its place. It shows us the beauty of ourself. It shows us something about ennobling, and it can be very refreshing. Once I developed a concussion from a fall I took while walking in the woods. Later in the emergency room, a doctor said I would be sensitive to light and sound for several days. What he didn't say was that my other senses would be heightened as well. I had a sudden and intense appreciation of food. Eating a cherry tomato was akin to a fireworks finale in my mouth. The flesh was sweet and sometimes quite salty, and each seed was an explosion of taste. I felt such awe that I wanted to applaud. I sipped drinks, even water, and slowly swished them around in my mouth to find all the different subtleties they held. Oatmeal, pita chips, salad greens, and cheese were just extraordinary. Even just walking into the house while onions were sautéing on the stove gave me sensory overload. Because everything tasted far better to me than before, I was always excited to eat. I worried at first that I might overindulge, but I didn't. A bite was completely satisfying, and a single serving was a feast. So that's the transition from sense pleasure to the second kind of pleasure, which is the pleasure of a focused mind. Let's say this person was hit on the head and they kind of got into that capacity to really do the vitaka thing, where your mind is completely focused, making the simplest of experiences blossom. And that can happen as we start to really feel into the simple experiences of being here. Like actually, boredom is lack of attention, and usually consists of a lot of wishing that something else were happening because one is so bored, like thinking like if only I could have a more extreme or interesting experience than this. But I encourage you to check out how to work with boredom. Often it's a subtle pulling back to see what the experience is actually expressing, and if you pull back and you're not staying connected, then move in and say, like, I'd actually like to be in this moment. You'll see is that there's sort of this shifting, like, thought pattern that isn't exactly connected to what's happening right now. So just try to find where you can connect if boredom is what's going on. Another thing that can help the mind come into focus, that was, who was it that said, that British thinker, that just before you get your head chopped off, it focuses your mind most wonderfully. Who was that? I think it was Samuel Johnson, who said that, if you're facing the guillotine, you'll be very focused. There's a teaching called the Adumvara flower, which is a metaphor for this moment and also for one's life. It's this absolutely beautiful flower that blooms only once in a millennium. That it's about the preciousness of life and the preciousness of moments. We've talked about that, about how each one of us is really this exquisite symphony of causes and conditions that's at play, and it's never the same twice. Can't step in the same river twice, and we don't really appreciate that when we're putting our happiness in the future. This moment is actually perfect in being the way that it is, and the open mind can see much more beauty in it, even if it's in a minor key or even if there's sadness. Often I find sadness actually rather pleasant. It has an expression of love in it. Like you wouldn't be sad if you hadn't cared about whatever it was that's making you sad. It's sort of, a nice kind of gloomy. Reflecting on death can also focus the attention on this moment, this fleeting day of our life. I've been working with my husband, who I've been talking about. He always hates it when I talk about him in Dharma Talks. He just says, like, you're using me as an example again. But in the last few months, he's had this tumor in his sacrum that's been really grave. At first we thought he was had a metastatic prostate cancer, and he's a little bit older than me anyway, which makes him stubborn and thinks that he's the boss all the time because he's older. But all of a sudden it seemed like our life together might suddenly really change, and we might lose what we had in terms of all the abilities of things that we could do, like garden or take walks or all that stuff, and I might lose him, both the most beloved and most annoying person in my entire life. And it really started to be so beautiful, like, what if this person is taken away? And I'd just look at his hand and just be like so incredibly touched by it. Or the way he'd be sleeping, everything just was like kind of ravishing me at that time. And it was pretty hard. And we found out that it's a non-malignant tumor. It might not be it's a benign one, but it might not be a friendly one. So we're still hanging on that thread a little bit. And it's just that we've been conscious of hanging on that thread, like, any one of us could die, soon. We, keep learning that the last time you saw someone is actually the last time that you're ever going to see them, especially the older you get. Like, people start to go, people who were part of your life or who were like a big piece of your life in some way. You pass by where they used to live and they're just not around anymore. It's really strange. So a shortcut to focus and concentration is that. One time there was a joke on this long 3-month course that I was on where, I don't know if it's actually true, it's maybe like an urban myth of Insight Meditation Society. I think it's not true, but there was one person who, after hearing that story about the blind turtle sticking their head up through the yolk that was floating in all the oceans, and that the coincidence of having the teachings and the ability to meditate and the time and all that stuff is so rare that it's like a blind turtle swimming in that. So they'd go get in the bathtub, fill up the bathtub and pretend to be the turtle and try to come up through a little life preserver, like to increase the urgency of their practice. Do you think that could be true? I don't think so. Anyway, when we have the energy and the skill in our mind, like that bright quality of ability to focus, it can bring an incredible kind of sense of peace and balance and joy and zest and like vividness in the mind. It's quite unbelievable. And if you've had it ever in your retreat, or you see how attached you can be to the pleasure in the mind, like the mind-made ecstasies of meditation or of anything else, like even just clicking on things on the internet is supposed to be quite addictive, but the more mental bliss, the more slightly inclination there is to try to repeat it. I remember my first retreat, I somehow was able to concentrate in such a way that, the reaction to pleasant and unpleasant was, at least the reaction to unpleasant was very low. So one time the cooks served this warm goat's milk. This was like California in the early 70s, so they were like all this emphasis on natural food. It didn't even have to taste very good, but there was this fresh goat's milk that they served warm one time at dinner, and I thought, wow, this is such a treat. I am going to throw my little powdered ginseng tea packet in here and have an amazing, feast of healthiness. And it was horrible. It was like the worst tasting thing, but there was no aversion in my mind. So I was tasting it thinking like, this tastes horrible, and my mind is actually perfectly happy. Wow, I drank the whole thing. And I was like so thrilled with myself, like, I can really meditate now. But then the next retreat, I kept trying for the same level of like complete equanimity, and it just didn't occur. Instead, like my whole psychological life came back to me, and I had to work through that, which was sort of a much deeper process, which I'm still involved in. Like the totality, it wasn't just sort of the surface layer of like concentration. It's almost like the meditation gods sometimes give you this incredible treat at first, like your mind like totally opens up, and that's wanting to get that back again keeps you going through things that are much more difficult. In any case, whatever we feel like comes up in our meditation, if we can really open up to the quality of whatever experience it might be, whether it's the boring old breath or the footstep or the mind state that's so difficult or shaming or something like that, if we bring that present moment awareness to it, it says mindfulness has the magical quality of turning obstacles to meditation into meditation objects. It's like a twist. Suzuki Roshi said, if you have some experience of how the weeds in your mind can turn into nourishment, your practice will make remarkable progress. So there's no mood or emotion or desire or sensation, no breath that's unworthy of our dedication, faith, and interest. This Adamvara flower that blooms every billion years it's a new mind state every time we find ourselves remembering the same thing or wanting the same thing. We don't realize that it's kind of a fresh moment. We think it's, as my friend Julio Suarez used to say, ay, tú como siempre, or you like all the time. It's not that, it's really the flower. So this is moving from the happiness of concentration to the happiness of equanimity, which starts to see where the wisdom starts to come in. In concentration, the mind gets purified a little bit of hindrances like aversion and desire, and it's really with what's happening, it really merges in that way. But then, as we open our heart and mind again and again to the pleasant, the unpleasant, and the thing in between, there's this kind of equanimity that becomes willing to open up the heart, rain or shine, and that's both a quality of something more like love and wisdom together. It starts to feel okay if we are not perfect, like perfect is what we are not. Like this whole thing about dukkha and impermanence and non-self, that's actually us. Like we're not perfect. How much do we feel like we should be? How much do we feel like if we just tweaked our experience a little more, it would feel better? No, it's not really like that. So here's this poem from one of those irresistible Sufi poets. How did the rose ever open its heart and give to this world all its beauty? It felt the encouragement of light against its being. Otherwise, we all remain too frightened. So it's this kind of like a flower unconditional opening the attention of the heart and mind to whatever's happening, whether it's rain or shine or boredom, which takes courage and the steady effort not to tune out or space out when things get harder. And also the subtlety of letting go of grasping when something, or whatever reaction of the mind, when things are easy and wonderful. Or being able to tolerate when we can't quite see it clearly enough to prevent the habitual response of the mind. So there's equanimity for that, for the in and out of the breath, or the up and down of the mind, or the time when there's a hindrance, or the time when we feel relatively stable, open, and connected. Like, that's the deeper level of the practice. We're not only trying to get stable and open and connected, we're actually trying to be with the whole range. Pat Enkyo O'Hara, this Zen teacher, says, stop being afraid to fail. Stop looking over, she was talking about herself, I wanted to stop looking over my shoulder to see if I was doing okay. So we start to look at ourselves closely enough that we actually start to see ourselves. And that's when we start to have some deeper experiences. She writes, I call it intimacy because it's a kind of suddenly feeling really completely so close to yourself and everything else that the question of fear doesn't arise. What arises instead is a kind of caring, a feeling of stewardship for everything, and trying to find a way to express that in service that makes sense for ourselves. We're all different. We all have different scopes in life and different responsibilities and different sort of little Buddha mandala fields where this quality of service and responsiveness will express itself. as they say in Tibetan, 30 yaks, 60 ways of growing a horn. So you all are the 14 yaks with 20 ways of growing your horns. And I came to see, like, over time that I was attached to the concentration highs so much because I wasn't really comfortable at all with certain of the kind of quasi-unconscious stuff that happened in me due to my childhood, which was, always feels like, well, I was the only one who had this kind of childhood, where growing up in this other country and Latin America with parents who had been lower middle class but were suddenly like these huge aristocrats with servants and, not exactly slaves, but people working in the house who'd left their own kids in some village somewhere and were cooking for us instead. And it was really unbelievable to think, like, why am I this person when their kids can't be here? And really wrestling with those questions in a very guilty way when I was growing up, and until I started to really look at, actually in a certain way, all those systemic forces that create this. It wasn't my fault, but I felt like it was when I was growing up. So it was hard to really look at what was going on in me until I had a certain stability and concentration and the kind of access to a sense of happiness or control in my mind before it would go any deeper. And when it goes deeper, it may just be a matter of, a quicker disentangling skill. So Rebecca Solnit says, accommodating change and uncertainty requires a looser sense of self, an ability to respond in various different ways. This is why qualified or partial success unsettles people who are locked into a fixed position. They tend to shift back and declare failure. She writes, I'm interested in the kind of people who love the world more and in what they have to tell us. What we can do begins with what we believe we might be able to do. It begins with being open to possibilities and interested in complexities. So the complexity is things like how, a sense of loneliness and despair is actually worth our caring attention, and how maybe it leads to some creative response if we're not locked into the pattern of responding to our loneliness in the same old way that we always used to, by, I don't know what, whatever unsuccessful acting out we've been locked into. And it really, really helps as we begin to notice that anything that comes into our mind also goes out, so that we're kind of not just one thing, like not one identity, but actually many. I talked about that last night, that our experience is always changing. It's nothing more than a series of mental and physical events. The awareness can tell us that. One thing after another. Here's the biography of a cloud. It's hard to say even where it was born, though considering its thick, whipped texture and lofty processional manner, I place it somewhere over a body of water, fathered by heat and mothered by humidity. In the end, it dies as all clouds do, in obscurity. I want to train my eye on the bright, shifting edges where the weightless tongues of clouds lick the air. I want to remove my hat and close my eyes and feel the sun, warm and intermittent, on my face, says Billy Collins. On the wall of a cave in Thailand, what a joy to know that there's no permanent happiness in this world. So our mind grasps and doesn't get it, and then after a time, after watching this just being a mind and just being a body, just this arising and passing away, including the grasping and the releasing and the letting go and the forgetting and the imperfect mindfulness and the distraction and the going into your room and looking at your stuff, and then being the perfect person and really, really focused all of a sudden. You're not defined by any one of those particular moments. And the issue is that this self-structure, the fixation structure, keeps locking us in at different times and thinking it's really like this, like that has this quality of determinacy. Like it's as if what they study on the level of the brain is that there's this, outside of our perception, we don't actually really know what's going on very much, because what's not mysterious for us in a certain sense is consciousness, because consciousness is everything that we experience. We don't know what's past the way our brain structures everything. There's this feeling that there's this kind of roaring soup out there that our brain like arranges into something that feels more consistent, and sometimes like really clamps down and doesn't want there to be the uncertainty that's actually real. But we have to let a certain amount of uncertainty in, this kind of flawedness or the humanity or the imperfection. Otherwise, we cannot be happy. There was a story in the New York Times Sunday magazine a few weeks ago about Iceland. I don't know if any of you saw it, where they said that maybe people in that society are relatively happier because the officials and the housewives and the dads and the moms and everybody ends up in the hot tub together naked at the end of the day. Like, they're all just humans with their bodies getting in hot water together, and call it like the retreat. It's this intimacy with what we call the humanness, but it's also sort of the tenderness of all reality itself. So humans and the mayor and us and naked here in the water together in a certain way. With each other as well. So a little bit about each other, because we're in the retreat together, we are making this possibility of having a quite private experience by the way that we are with each other, which is something quite beautiful. You know, we have these agreements to allow ourselves this supported solitude, and we may not recognize how much each other's, you know, this kind of very special company makes us available to ourselves in a deeper way. Like one time at IMS, I was doing this, you know, intensive time in retreat, and I started to decide that, you know, it was so common just to go in the meditation hall and listen to the talks and stuff. I was going to stay in my room, and I obtained from the kitchen this almond butter jar to pee in, because I decided I was too good even to go to the bathroom as often as I needed to. I would pee in my room, and I was going to be like this super person. And one day I realized, you know, I'd hear everybody going to the Dharma Talk and their feet kind of rattling down the hall, and I'd be there, and it'd be starting to get dark in my little room, and it was the winter and stuff, and there I was, me in my little pee jar, and it was like, oh God. So I started sneaking down and listening to the Dharma Talk from the outside, so that people still, when they saw me in the dining room, they'd say, who's that? Like, wow, we never see her. She must be going so deep. And at some point I realized, this is so stupid. And I went back in the meditation hall, you know. Actually, it was because there was this really like demented person who had been adopted a little bit by the staff, who he was like this very damaged ex-Marine who like didn't even see reality clear enough to take his shoes off where everybody else did. So he'd go clonking into this upper walking room. If anyone's ever been at IMS, it's this beautiful stained glass room and stuff. So I'd be slithering in from my little cubicle, and he'd be clonking in his big black Marine shoes going clonk, clonk, clonk. And we'd both be sitting there, and I was like, me and him, we are on an equal plane right now. It was kind of sweet, you know. It's like I am as off in my own little demented plane as he is, you know. It sort of showed me something about my fixation on having a perfect meditation practice, let me say. So there's this French geophysicist whom I often quote and whose work I really love, he's Catholic, Xavier Le Pichon, who writes about fragility and equanimity and the need for both together, that there can't be any equanimity and without that kind of rising and falling that Pat was talking about. Equanimity is the ability of our mind to be okay with all of it. The rising and falling of empires, and the rising and falling of mental states, and the in and out of the breath, and the way this world has of seeming somewhat more than dualistic, multiplistic. Le Pichon went to Calcutta and saw this like dying child there in one of the hospices, and he looked into the kid's eyes. He was trying to feed it. I think it was too weak to even eat. And he said, this exchange between the child and me penetrated to the deepest level of my being. I felt I cannot become fully human without you. So there's a way that this suffering or this brokenness in ourselves and in each other is necessary for us to be fully human or fully enlightened. It's kind of one of those mysteries that as we enter into relationship with things as they actually are, we see the suffering of the suffering and the joy that's impermanent. And to know that it's not permanent or personal, but it's shared is really important. So if we're in the position of trying to help someone or help the world or feel like we're a participant in a wholesome way, it's like to let the pain into our heart without an agenda right away, especially that it must stop on our time. To start to see that most of the time if someone is irritating us in some way or other, they may actually be in pain. And that's not a way of squashing our own reaction, which is what I used to construct that, like, oh, that poor person. Like there's that New Yorker cartoon or whatever it is, like where somebody's been knifed on the sidewalk and the social worker runs up and says, where's the poor person that did this to you? Not like that, But having room for both, seeing that what the needy and angry mind want is ultimately compassion and connection in some way, even if it may not be possible to have that conversation or have that interaction with someone, to know that, the person who can never fill the void with other than either shoes or corporate expansion or something like that does have a void, even if they'll never acknowledge it and they'll run over you to get what they want. That to hold that sense that no one who isn't human. So let's say that this le pichon moment of seeing one another, it's almost held for us by the space of a meditation retreat. This is a place where we're able to say, like, no, we're not our fault. Each other is not each other's fault. There's a compassion, there's an understanding that to be a human being is to have this greed and hatred and delusion and obsession and craziness in our mind. And that's what the Buddha said, and that seems to be who we are. We didn't ask for this. We just seem to come with it. That's why the Buddha said, don't worry about where it comes from, just worry about bringing it to an end. And I feel like in this sense, we're not alone, and we do need one another in some way to get the message that the things we're most ashamed of or afraid of are really deeply okay, especially as long as we're not taking them out on someone else. It's just like the container of some, dedicated relationship. I talked a little bit about being married to my husband, and that was kind of the perfect place for me to work out a lot of the things I came to adulthood with, with this person who always leaves his hair in the tub drain, always. Yet I love, So not to make an artificial barrier between what we have here, either the wisdom or the pain, that we are sharing this together and we don't own it, any of us. We're not really alone. We're all going through this wave. And what the Buddha said about things to do included these activities of mind that are actually fairly demanding. Like you could almost feel like you're in some kind of mental training gym, the kind of strange effort that we're being asked to make. Psychophysical depth of vision means, actually recognizing what's happening and seeing what's going on, seeing the color of our mind and the ups and downs and those things. So that then something can happen where it's like this, something arises and we just respond to it naturally without such a barrier of self and other. It was funny, like today I was walking down the hill and there was this funny little dog down there, and people who walk probably have seen it. It has the craziest looking little pug mix thing that's kind of looks like a little monster, and it comes out going, and it's looking for something, and it's like it wags, and my hand goes down, and I pet the dog, and there's a moment, there's a moment there of some kind of connection that's very natural. I do not have to keep my walking going, I can respond just like that. So it's not all about enduring things. And when we get out of the retreat, some of our hindrances need to be sort of lived away in our life. Some of our really habitual patterns are things that we need to take action with. We'll talk about that more toward the end. But for now, to be as open as we can and as sort of intelligent as we can with whatever comes up, watching that this portal of awareness and gentleness allows a wiser side of ourselves to come into play. And as we see that more and more, we drop from the story of our life and the narrative about who we are into something that's much bigger, that's normally in the background. It's bigger and a little more gentle for us. So we see that as we see when are we with the gentleness and when are we all tied up with and obscured with the stuff in our mind. Like each one has its own kind of value for us. The last part of this is this Hafiz poem. Like one of my teacher friends says, and I'll end with a poem. I will end with a poem, I will. Learn to recognize the counterfeit coins that may buy you just a moment of pleasure and then drag you for days like a broken man behind a farting camel. Oh, keep squeezing drops of the sun from your prayers, your work and music, and from your companion's beautiful laughter, and from the most insignificant movements of your own holy body. Now, sweet one, be wise. Cast all your votes for dancing. So I think by the word dancing, it's like the being in this flow and dancing with life as it is. So I hope you have felt slightly cheered up and interested by this Dharma talk. May we all have the three kinds of happiness, all three. Take a minute to sit and sort through, see what your heart and mind feel.